Hello everyone and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. I'm absolutely delighted that we have Finbarr Bradley with us today, and there's Finbarr, has just appeared with us, and I hope you both find it useful and enjoyable. So with that, I am going to hand over to Finbarr. Thank you very much, Finbarr.
Okay, thanks, Emer. This is the panic stage where I'm trying to figure out how to share the screen. New share.
You're up there and ready to go.
I am, yeah, I see. Can you see this, Emer?
I can, yes.
Yeah, I'll blow it up so that it takes up the whole screen.
Can our audience let me know in the chat box that you can all see it? Yes, they should be able to see it now.
Can they, Emer?
I assume so, yes.
Okay, I'll start. Thanks very much, Emer.
Yes, everyone can see it. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Finbarr.
I panicked a bit there at the beginning, Emer, because I'm not sure how you organized this, but they had no participants a minute before the time. And I was thinking back, I know you have some system where you let everybody in or something, but I was thinking back when I used to go around to high schools or secondary schools trying to promote a degree. And I remember turning up at some school where whatever time was a wet winter night, and the principal was there. And he said, "Oh yeah, we have all the tea ready and the sandwiches for all the parents and whatever was interested." But like at about 5 past the hour, nobody had arrived. 10 past, he kept on making excuses, and he felt so bad. And nobody turned up that night.
Okay, well, can I reassure you that you have a large audience this afternoon, and I'd also like to reassure our audience that this is a very esteemed emeritus professor, previously professor of finance and all things good and lovely, who's going to talk to us for the next 45 minutes. So
thanks,
let's go.
I shouldn't have told that story, maybe. But anyway, I'll start off. I know a lot of the people here today are makers and designers, etc. And one of the great heroes, I'm no designer myself or maker. As Emer said, I'm some academic, but I know that Buckminster Fuller is one of the great gurus. So in many ways, I thought this would be a good slide to start off with. As you can see, I said it was about setting the scene. So, and what he's saying here essentially is what I'm trying to do today, which is to argue that the approach I'm going to take to, I think, what's happening in the world of business, especially in the area of craft, etc., is not about making changes at the margins, etc. It's about a different paradigm. It's about a different way of thinking about what's happening in the world. So I thought it was a good way to sort of set the scene. So I wrote a book with a colleague from Austria and from the States a few years ago. And again, setting the scene, I wanted to show the sort of philosophy that we had in that book, because a lot of the examples I'm going to use today are from that book, and the thinking behind a lot of what I'm going to describe today is also from that book. And you can see it's a very simple diagram. I'm not sure which of us drew it originally, but the idea, you can see on the left-hand side, it shows some sort of miserable tree, very bare with no leaves and sort of very shallow roots, as it says, and the purpose is making money, it says somewhere near the base. And then there's shareholders and short-term profits. And on the right-hand side, you see it's a very rich environment where the roots are very deep, or at least they're described as very deep, and they're depicted as very deep. You have values going up the trunk, and then you have a whole flourishing leaves and branches and everything up at the top, employees, shareholders, customers. And then down on the right, you see this community and the environment, etc. And what we were trying to show, and I used it in the title of today's talk as well, is the difference between what is often called money value and what a lot of people assume is value, and what we're calling on the right-hand side real value, sorry, money value on the left. And when I say money value, as Emer said, I taught finance for many years and now teach about green ventures, etc. But on the left-hand side, the idea was, it always has been that if you focus on sort of making shareholders happy, or whatever they're called, the owners or whatever, that everything will sort of flourish as a result of that. And I think that's an old way of thinking, and it's becoming more and more clear that it is out of date as a way of thinking. So what a lot of what I'll be describing today about is sort of going against the orthodoxy, against the conventional thinking. But hopefully you'll see the sort of argument, especially when I get to craft. And another term.
Sorry, I need to interrupt you for just one
Sorry.
second. I don't want to disturb your flow.
Right.
Can you please turn your sound up as much as you can, and speak directly into your mic?
Is it very low?
It's intermittent.
Oh God, I should. Let me see where the. I'm not sure where the sound is on this. I'm not sure where I can find the sound either. Let me get rid of the big screen and see if I can see. I see the sound now. I'm afraid I'm not able to make it any bigger than what it is at the moment.
I'm sorry to have to do this, but I think it'll just be clear for everybody. So if everyone can just bear with us for a second.
Sorry, I assumed it was
perfect. Right. Bye.
Is it okay, Emer?
Perfect. Off you go.
All right. Oh gosh, I have lost my train of thought now. Let me go back.
If you go back maybe 2 slides, and my apologies.
Oh, that's okay. Here's what I was trying to show. Let me just blow that up and show you. Okay, the second thing I wanted to talk about as an introduction was this idea of, I mentioned in the previous slide, flourishing. And you'll notice I put on the very top, I said green equal flourishing, or equal, sort of the idea being that I think the way of thinking about green is again flawed. When in the last slide, I described that thinking about the economy in narrow terms, or about what the purpose of business is, I think is deeply flawed. If you think about it in money terms, or making profit, etc. Here, I'm saying the same about green. That in many ways it's seen as sort of a technical thing to do with, how technology will reduce, carbon emissions, etc. I think it's a far better way to think of it in terms of flourishing or thriving, or as I put in a definition that I liked a lot here from a book in 2013, sustainability and green, which are sort of interchangeable in the way I'm talking today at least, is the possibility that humans and other life will flourish on the earth forever. So the idea is that we as humans are an integral part of the world. And therefore, flourishing should not be seen as sort of something that is sort of confined to humans, or green is something to do with plants or something outside ourselves. It's far richer than that. It's about how you create, going back to the previous slide, real value. In a sense, it's about how you create an environment which is flourishing, as I said, rather than sort of that something does well, like the diagram I had in the previous slide, that the economy or business is doing well, and somehow we all do well, and not only humanity, but non-humans do well. So, and I put underneath it because it's, again, terms I'll be using a lot today, the difference between authentic, or what is authentic, and what is authentic living. And they're very closely related to green and to what I call flourishing. But being authentic, it's very confusing a lot of times, because it doesn't mean it is not changing. It doesn't mean it doesn't, it has to be kind of kept constant. As you see in the second bulleted point under authentic, I put it as sort of almost a clash between two things, or as I call them here, contradictions. That is, being authentic, or something being authentic, is not necessarily fixed, but it's about a balance between things that I point here: static and changing, conservative, adaptable, original and modern. And then authentic living, which is somewhat a different concept, but obviously related, is about being true to yourself, and about, in a sense, doing something because it's you reflected very deeply on it, and you're going to do it because it is, as you've reflected deeply on it, is the way you truly want to live and you want to be true to yourself and truthful to others. So that those concepts I wanted to start with, and then I have three stories, again to sort of show or to illustrate what I feel is going on in the world, and that is of great, I think, importance to craft. These are not necessarily craft examples, but they're small enough and sort of focused enough that I think that the implications are really important. The first example here is for an Austrian company. You can see they make organic teas, etc. Founded 30 years ago. It has done, in financial terms, very well. But look what I put under it. I put some points about that the company is actually going against all the sort of stuff you teach in business schools. Um, the owner doesn't really focus on profits. He basically, his philosophy is in that second point I have under it, which is he sort of live and let live is the way he sees it. So he for example uses manual labor rather than cheap machines. Again, goes against the orthodoxy. You don't try and minimize your labor costs, is what you'd normally be told, minimize your labor costs. He sees farmers, and if I may say so, a lot of them are the wives of farmers in the area. And rather than try and put in cheap machines, he gives them employment and they package the products, etc. And then, as I show in the rest of those points, he himself doesn't really have any, focus on the long term. He doesn't pay himself that much, um, and he pays farmers twice what a lot of his competitors pay. And yet the company is thriving. Again, I put up the top, as you can see. I was trying to show the difference between um, uh, two concepts that are oftentimes seen as in conflict. That is, it's a flourishing enterprise, and at the same time, it is setting limits. For economists who teach you about how you should scale and grow, etc., it seems to be very bizarre that here's a company that is setting its own limits. These are not limits imposed by somebody else. It's setting its own limits, and yet it's thriving or flourishing. Why? Because it's driven not by money, but by a deeper purpose than money. And yet, and this is the fascinating thing about these three examples I'm going to give, they actually do far better in money terms, even though they don't focus on the money. So what I'm really trying to get across is that, and this almost seems like heresy to a lot of my colleagues in academia, teaching economics, etc., that the most profitable companies, the most profitable enterprises are those that spend the least amount of time focusing on profit. What they do is they focus on why they're doing something. That is, in a sense, they're being authentic, as this example shows. And by being authentic, by standing for something, by rebelling against maybe the thinking that's out there a lot of times, they actually do very well financially. But in a way, you can't fake it. I'm not saying you can sort of pretend that you care about the things that the previous example cared about. That is fake it and then make lots of money. You've got to really believe. A word I could have put here, but I decided not to put it, was sacrifice. In a sense, you have to sort of be willing to sacrifice because you believe truly in something. If you believe truly in something and you can show that by your willingness to sacrifice, then you thrive. A second example from Germany, I won't go through the details, but you can see in some of the bullet points here, it's been around since the 20s. And the strange thing about this example is that it doesn't want to grow. You see, I put an exclamation mark on one of the bullet points. So it rejects growth in sales. It doesn't want to grow. It wants to stay at around 50 employees, about the same amount of sales. And what it focuses on, I use the term internal growth rather than outside growth. That is, the owners of the company, this family, have decided that they would rather create an environment or a milieu where not just themselves are content with their employees, the community, etc., and that rather than trying to grow and make more profit, as it were, that they would much prefer to create that sort of environment where everybody's not under pressure, etc. And what is happening at a company like this, you see it in the last few points, is that because their products are so good, so they go for quality rather than quantity. They spend a lot of time on the design and trying to figure out how you design something so it'll last forever. Again, going against a lot of the thinking. Um, they are prepared to repair any product, and in many ways, the company ends up having to people come back with 40 or 50 years later with deck chairs saying, I've had it for 40 or 50 years. Can you repair the stuff, the lining or the stuff that holds the fabric up? And yet, what is happening in this company is that the business is thriving in the repair business. So it's good for. There's a huge increase in repair business. The customers are happier because they're not buying new deck chairs, and it's better for the environment because you're not using steel. And the third example, my last example, is a very famous example. I'm sure many people here today might have heard of it. It's obviously a bigger company, Patagonia, the US company, who sort of 20 years ago put a big ad in the New York Times. It became a very famous ad where they said, basically, don't buy our stuff. You don't need it. We'll repair it for you. Do you really need a new jacket, etc., etc. This is part of the ad I'm showing here. And again, here's a company that's thriving, and it's thriving because, in many ways, it has a purpose for being, if you will, and that out of this sort of approach, where they genuinely believe in what they're doing and feel that they have a calling, an old-fashioned word, or a vocation, if you will, to do something to save the world, or to, in this case, sort of make jackets that last a long time, etc., etc. They're trying to sort of the business itself is one which thrives financially, and yet it isn't aiming to make money. I could tell much more about what it does. It goes against the thinking. So now that I've sort of introduced what seems sort of radical and strange and going against, as I said, the way they teach in business schools, mostly they still talk about minimizing costs and scaling up. A lot of our policies from a public policy point of view is based on what I regard as an old way of thinking. And that's why I introduced those examples. And to take now, it looks like a complicated diagram, but it's actually very simple. And I added a little bit to bring it up to date myself. You notice I drew a blue line on the bottom right, and I said meaning with an arrow going up. That was my drawing. The rest of it I took from a Harvard Business book that has recently been published by two people who were sort of gurus in the area of experiences. Of, people talk a lot. I saw in previous talks. I watched back on some of the previous webinars from the Design and Crafts Council, and there was a lot of talk about experiences and about the experience economy and how do you create experiences, etc. And what's interesting about these two characters who wrote that book, or the first book they wrote in 1999, 20 years ago, is that they stopped at what they call the experience economy. As you can see, if you go up from the bottom left, they talked about, commodities being the sort of basic thing, then manufacturing or making goods, delivering services, and they stopped at staging experiences. But now they've sort of accepted that 20 years later, they're now saying it's really about transformation. It's about, they're using you see the verb is guiding or guide transformation, and the other terms sort of fit in with the sort of thing that is happening with in previous eras. And so if you look at this diagram, okay, on the left-hand side, it talks about differentiated versus undifferentiated. So as we go up the diagonal, if you will, up to from the bottom left up to the top right, you see products are becoming more differentiated. That is more, if you will, different or distinctive. Also, if you look at the right-hand side and go up, you'll see that it goes from irrelevant to the customers to relevant to the customers. So as the customer, that's why I use the word meaning, which I thought was a better way of describing what's going up on the axis, on the diagonal axis. And then I put down at the bottom pricing. So pricing going up as people are prepared, are willing to pay more for something that has far deeper meaning, that in some way, to use the terms that they're guiding transformation. I'd like to explain though what transformation is. Transformation here, the real meaning of transformation is sort of beyond experiences, but it goes back to what I was talking at the beginning about authenticity. I defined authenticity or authentic living as being living your true values or truly what you truly believe in, having reflected on. Well, in a sense, transformations are the same thing, but it's about how do you become who you truly are by being transformed by buying something or wearing something or going on a vacation somewhere or whatever. That 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 you become transformed not into somebody else, but who you truly are, who you truly want to be, or who you want to live your life, having reflected deeply on it. So the really holy grail and what I'm now going to talk for the rest of the talk is really how do we enter the transformation age, or how in particular do makers, do people in the craft area in particular, um, how do they become part of this transformation age or transformation economy? And and to do that, any of my former students who might be here today will have seen this diagram before, because in a way it sort of it captures in one slide what I always start my classes with. No matter where I teach, I always start with this slide or the first session, and I always at the end of a semester come back to the slide to ask the students, um, have I actually, in the last so many weeks, have I really covered um, what I have on the left-hand side and the right-hand side and shown what is happening in the world? Because I spend the rest of the semester really using loads of examples of cases and discussions on what is really happening in this world, what I call the transformation age or transformation experiences. I gave it a different word here at the top on the right-hand side. I call it the regenerative age, because in many ways what is happening now is that the word green or sustainable is sort of out of date, or is not really what, it's an old way again of thinking about being sustainable is not where we are. We have to regenerate um, because the world is in too much of a crisis to be regenerated, to be sustainable. Sustainable is a sense, in a sense, if you have a sustainable anything, it's really not a healthy way of living. So on the left-hand side, I wanted to again capture, I won't go through each of these, but I wanted to show a lot of the thinking that's going on in policy making at the moment um, is based on sort of a mix of thinking that they're talking about the right-hand side, talking about uh, the transformation age and regeneration and sustainability and all those wonderful terms, but is actually based on industrial age thinking. Because on the left-hand column, what I call the industrial age, it's really a paradigm or a way of thinking or a sort of a pattern of life that is based on the factory, on material goods, on something physical, that the value in a sense is in the physical. Whereas if you go back to my previous slide, and certainly if you look at what's happening on the stock markets, etc. I mean, in the last 30 years, the difference between the value of a stock, for example, that is based on the physical nature of the product and or if you will, the tangible nature of the product versus the intangible nature is phenomenal. Like 30 years ago, I don't have the figures, but for example, I would say 30 or 40 or 50% of the value of a company stock. Um, uh, Actually, I go back to the 70s. 10% of the value of a company stock was in intangibles. It's now the opposite. 90%, and I'm talking averages. 90% is probably in the intangible now. So in a way, that what the markets are showing is what I'm trying to show here, but it's still not grasped, I feel, by a lot of policymakers. So going down to the left, talking about the left for a second, you see that I put at the top logic or science or facts or reality, and that the purpose of the economy is to make stuff, and that having things and consuming things and needing things and wanting things and growing is all sort of part of what the purpose of an economy is. Whereas if you go to the right-hand side, where I put at the top, it's really about well-being. It's about thriving, as I said earlier, or flourishing. It's really about making meaning or making sense. That is really where the Holy Grail is. It's based not so much on logic or science or facts, but it's based on stories, on spirit. I know um, um, a lot of what Sally talked about last week on was about stories, and it makes sense in this diagram, because if you go down then again to the left hand side, that the concept of the economy then was as a machine. It's about mass production, rationality, and that the purpose of business is to make money, and that, you know, the future just matters if you, you know, and that employees sort of make a good living. That's sort of the logic of it. Whereas on the right hand side, you can see I'm talking about making sense, being, to be, and that caring and degrowth. Now, degrowth has this sort of sense that, oh my gosh, you're trying to sort of damage people and people won't have any opportunities. That is not true. It's a way of thinking about the balance, if you will, between the spiritual and the material. And that what I was showing in the previous diagram, even though I didn't use the word spiritual, I was really saying that most people are trying to find that balance between what is materially a need, if you will, and a spiritual need. And therefore, degrowth, this idea of less is more, is becoming far more prominent. So down, as I go down further on the right hand side, you'll notice that in the concept of the economy, they're very fuzzy terms. They're all sort of, compared to the left hand side, which is about quantity, I have a word like quality. How do you measure quality? Or when I have on the left hand side mass production, you have on the right hand side customized, personalized. You have words like emotions. And then down at the bottom, you can see that real value or a living purpose, meaning and purpose and transformation are really the goals of business. And that and why I'm going to talk so much about place today is because place, as you can see, I call them place-based enterprises, which have deep roots, is that they are the ones that are most likely to generate the sort of things that are in the middle part of that diagram, that are the valuable things in today's emerging transformation age. Now, and I illustrated that in the previous diagram, as you can see. I'm not saying that we're ever, and in fact, it probably is highly unlikely in my own lifetime, that we'll ever get to the regenerative age. We're always going to be somewhat in between the industrial and the regenerative. But the trend, the reason I put the arrow going in both directions up at the top, the trend, is no doubt about it, is to the right-hand side. That is, we're moving towards, the forces are such. And because the world is in such crisis now, in not just in COVID, but in fact in the climate area, there is no doubt there's even going to be more of a push to the right-hand side, to this idea of the, and just to give a small example of that, a very simple and quick example is again this focus on tradition. You can see that tradition. I took a quote from a Scottish newspaper that I read a few years ago, which I thought said it very well. That tradition is not about the past, really. It's about inheriting something and then going back to what I call this balance between in authenticity. That is, how do you retain something without losing its essence? So it's balancing the past with the future. So I like the way they called it, distilling the meaning of the past, distilling it into the present, and then caring and passing it on. And even an economic journal like The Economist makes it very clear that that's really what's going to happen more and more with the internet. That the more we have, if it will, the internet and the disruptive innovations, as he calls it here, the more there is a role for the sort of things I was describing in the previous diagram. I won't go through the bottom one, but I just want to remind people that, like, there are more wristwatches sold today than ever before. Well, maybe not ever before, but certainly they all went through a real dive in the 60s when the Casio, I'm old enough to remember when watches from Japan were far more accurate, obviously with microchips or chips, than the old winding watches that you had to go through the pain of winding every day. But the that's thinking about watches, that the purpose of a watch is just to tell the time. Whereas the purpose of a watch is not just to tell the time, it also has this aesthetic quality to it. It's about craftsmanship. It's about sort of beauty and a whole bunch of things that are actually the reason why people nowadays buy wristwatches, or in the second example I have down there, fountain pens. I mean, fountain pen, you have to fill it with ink, it's messy and all this, and yet fountain pens are selling like anything. Why? Because the value more and more is not in the writing. You use fountain pens a lot of times because it looks good on you, and because it a special occasion, etc. And I won't go through the others, but one of them is there for you, Emer, because it's founded Lighthouse in Donegal. As you can see on the right hand side, it's lighthouses were just to tell ships not to crash or whatever, but a lighthouse keeper living in the lighthouse Now they're automated, obviously, and they're turning, as anybody knows in Ireland, a lot of the lighthouses have been converted into vacation places and people stay in them because the meaning of the lighthouse, in a way, is no longer about, they still stop ships from crashing, etc., because there is a light automated, but they're more than that. They're about something deeper, as they said. And of course, the Nokia on the right side. So, what then, to summarize before I go into craft and use these arguments that I've been using in the first half, I better look at my timing. Oh my God, I better rush. Let me see. What's the timing? Can I ask? Oh, I haven't. I better rush. I've been talking a lot. Okay. What I'm saying in this slide here is that, what has happened is science, and I think especially the tragedy in Ireland, I think, is that we focus so much on science, we haven't given enough attention to what is really valuable in Ireland, I think, is that the non-scientific, if you will. And so I put here, I said, scientific rationalism insists on objectivity and denies the subjective world of feelings. I've been spending half this today talking about feelings and imagination, aesthetics, etc. And that rootedness, this sense of belonging, is actually the biggest antidote at the moment to consumerism, etc., that I put in the second point. And yet, a lot of people today, and the reason why a lot of the trends that I've described in the previous slides is happening, is because a lot of people have an overwhelming sense of rootlessness and disconnection from the past. They want to be rooted, they want to be connected, they feel in a globalized world, in the world of the internet, etc., they want to be connected. That deep thing I called earlier about authenticity, etc., is driving them. So what I'm saying here in the last slide is reconnecting to our cultural roots, whether it's Irish mythology, Dean Gannicus, which is the Irish word for the lore of place names. Who are we? Where are we from? And it helps people to discover that deep sense of meaning, which is reflected in the products I will describe in the next few minutes. So place, this sense is a meaningful location. It's about the integration of culture and nature. And the best way of describing it is space is what you travel through, place is where you stop. So a sense of place, that sense of a connection with a place, that sense of feelings and attachment, that is actually where a lot of the value is now in products. And so enterprises that can in some way reflect that relationship with place, that have that sort of sense of stewardship, as I put here, or that have that real value, which I defined at the very beginning, that they are the ones that are the great hope. So I tried to capture it in this diagram, which is again sort of showing that the connection, it's really covering what I've done in the first half, which is rootedness and connectedness, which gives you a sense of who you are, or who am I, where I'm from, a sense of belonging, if you will. It helps people to get meaning, to be, or to have a purpose of some sort, to reflect on their calling. And it's out of that integrity and authenticity, or becoming, if you will, that is reflected in the products is emerges. And I put on the left-hand side sort of some of the terms in different languages that cover, they're not all the same thing. Terroir is different than dwelling, for example, an old English word, which covers the concept of belonging deeply in a place and feeling safe. So if we look at some of the examples then, Inishmaan, I always come back to Inishmaan, on the Aran Islands. If I'll go through these quickly because they're sort of nice examples, but they won't take much in terms of time. But then to reflect the sort of thinking I'm trying to show. Here's an example where they take an old sweater that was worn 100 years ago by an old fisherman, and they built their whole design around that, and the story, etc. And the bottom one, you can see the same thinking about the stone walls, the fences of the island. The sweater in some way is capturing that and showing the design. And even the pictures in the next diagram, again from 100 years ago, and the maps at the bottom, all part of their website. I only took those over the last few days, or took them from the website. Again, capturing this sense of place and why people are so attracted. And here's a company that's competing against fashion, Italian top fashion designers from Italy, etc. And yet they were based in the Aran Islands with all the disadvantages that that when they talk about business, they talk about, oh, you're marginal and different. And here's a company that's able to compete in Japan and in high fashion stores around the world based on what I'm talking about. And again, an example from Scotland of Nike forming a partnership with Harris for boots that have a sort of a sense of something that cannot be captured by the traditional Nike boots. I took an example from Wales of denim company that is used to make, you know, as it says here, 35,000 pairs of jeans a week, but is now making customized jeans worn by, I think, British royalty, etc., which has led to incredible opportunities for the company. Why? Again, because they're going back to something deeper about the relationship between the person who's wearing these clothes and the place itself. And you can see, I wanted to show that this is not just about one-off sort of people buying products, that this same person who set up the first company, that previous company, the jeans company, has also expanded into what he calls, you know, the encouragement network, which is bringing people together who are makers or creative people, and they stay intense and they have lectures and discussions, etc. So the potential for places that might sound or seem marginal, based on the logic of what I'm talking about today, I think is amazing. So I took an example because I teach in Finland. An example I like a lot from Finland is this one of grannies knitting. You know, it shows a bunch of grannies up at the top left, and then down in the sort of high fashion or the equivalent of Brown Thomas in Helsinki, you see that the grannies are kind of mega stars of some sort. They've been invited to Japan and various other countries because people are very taken by the idea of a product that has, again, that personalized, that customized, that deep sense of belonging to a special place. And just to show you, like, for example, again, as I said with the jeans company, that doesn't mean that it's just about sweaters. It's also about forming partnerships with other companies who might be from the same place, so that there's synergies and collaborations which lead to wonderful opportunities. So, for example, I tried to minimize the diagram of the top right because it's naked guys running in a rye field, because it's a distillery selling whiskey. But they formed a partnership with the grannies. You can see the grannies are on the left, sitting in the same rye field, but they're much more sedate, or whatever the word is. And then forming partnerships with other companies, fashion companies, etc. So to finish off, place and branding place. I wanted to show sort of an example from Denmark of that sort of this area in the north, an area that is very popular with artists, etc. Skagen or Skagen, I guess is how it's pronounced. But look at the way they're selling these watches. These are watches designed in this place, named for this place. And look at the way they talk about, you know, Denmark embodies a special kind of energy, modern, playful at the moment, with an appreciation for nature and the wild world around us. And then the watches themselves with the colors. On the bottom left, I put some of the houses in Copenhagen, and how the colors there inspire the watches. The link again with Denmark, the actual place. And I was so taken by it. I wanted to finish off by saying, what would Ireland and the products that come from Ireland, what way could we sell, or what is so special about us? And before I show it, it's a long quote, but it's from a very good friend of mine, who is kind of, I saw him once described as the grandfather of branding. I'm not sure he likes that title, but anyway, he's a crony of mine, and I go drinking with him. Well, I used to go drinking with him before COVID. And John, in a paper about 10 years ago, it's a long passage, but I just want to capture and finish off with it. John was sort of putting a proposal that in today's age, you know, what's Ireland's brand? What can we sell? You know, based on what I've been talking about today, I thought what John put on in this long quote was very, I think, captured very well what I've been talking about. You can see he talks about an island nation, etc. Then to continually define their identity in relation to more powerful neighbors, provided with a distinctive holistic world. And again, something I said earlier today, the pursuit of material prosperity must be accompanied by the pursuit of spiritual prosperity. in such a way that they enhance each other. Could we say that's true? I mean, I don't think we could actually say that that's the Irish brand at the moment, or at least maybe people will disagree with me later. But then it goes down and talks about, again, some of the stuff I've been talking about look at the last sentence. The Irish look at the world and see it whole. That word that I used earlier about authenticity being whole or integrity being whole, which gives them not only a more balanced perspective on life, but a more green perspective on the planet. And here we are, a country that is associated with the color green and all this, and you could not argue that we have performed this way, or at least, or a reputation, or our image, or to use a simpler word, brand, is not what I think is in it. But that my hope would be, it would be, because I actually think we're ideally suited for it. And but it will only take a paradigm shift, what I called earlier, a different way of looking at the world, moving to that diagram I had at the very beginning, that right-hand side to do with spirit and soul and the imagination. It will not come from the sciences. I mean, nobody's denying that the sciences are important, technology is important, but it's far more likely to come out of the spirit of. I think what a lot of the people who are in today's audience are probably doing themselves. It will come out of those types of people are more likely to lead to the sort of thing I'm capturing here. And so to finish off, my final slide, my real final slide, Emer, is I saw this cartoon in New Yorker many, many years ago, and I kept it, or reproducing it here. What would you suggest to fill the dark, empty spaces in my soul? And in a way, it sort of captures what I've been trying to say. The real holy grail, the real hunger I see in my own students, I see throughout society, the real holy grail is that other part that I call the balance between the material and the spiritual. And the real opportunity, I think, for our country more than any other country is to tap into that in some way. And that's kind of my story. So I'll stop, Emer, because I know I've gone over time.
No, you just don't know, Finbarr. It was it's really interesting. I mean, all I would say is myself and the audience that you have here, they're a kind of a mini doer network.
Yeah.
I would take out of it that there is a huge parallel and comparison between Denmark and places such as Bonham and Ireland.
Yeah.
So I really think, that you have the converted here. They're coming in by saying, you're very insightful and there are lots of great points and thank you, and that it's very interesting. But I definitely think you have the doer network listening to you here. And I have a comment that
will I stop? Sorry, Emer, for interrupting. Will I stop sharing so I might be able to see some people? Or
I can't unless I change the back end of the screen mode.
Okay, so will I leave this one up? So
yeah.
All right. Okay, that's okay. That's okay.
Unless would you like me to put everybody on audio? Would you like audio questions rather?
Well, I'm quite happy. I think that's what I do with my own students anyway.
Yeah, so. Well, you see, my issue, I think I mentioned it to you last night, is when I have a lot of people on, that meeting doesn't really work, but that's a silly technique.
Whatever works best for you, Emer, I'm happy to.
I'll release the whole thing and we'll have a free for all. But you could just put up with my voice for a second, please, Professor. Okay, that what Dan Taylor is saying, that that to students as an audience, as his entire professional career has been increased product quality and decreased production costs. Highly differentiate your product, and sales will be based on quality, user needs and wants. Okay, that's that. We have the what's coming through is love this. I can see how it really connects to business. Very much wish the government would change their thinking. There's an interesting one to what you've been showing us. So that's good. And you want me to put everybody on audio. Let's see how that's going to work. Participants. See if I can get them on audio from this end. I've got another one in the Q&A. If we just okay. Anonymous one here is thanks, Finbarr. That's been fantastic. If you're not Irish, but Ireland is not your home, how does one represent a sense of place? Okay,
if you're not
your home, right? But you're not Irish. This is a good one. How does one represent a sense of place?
Sorry for the beginning. The person is living in Ireland, is it?
Yeah, they're living. In Ireland is their new home, but
Oh,
they're
right.
not Irish.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because
Yes.
I have a few ways of looking at this. The first thing that has struck me, and I'd love to do some research in this, is I actually think there's probably more examples of the sort of innovative companies I was trying to describe today that were set up in Ireland by people who weren't born in Ireland than Irish people. That is, they're more likely, I think people who come from another country are more likely to see the great opportunities that this country offers in terms of some of the stuff I was talking about today than we ourselves see. That's just a slight aside. It sort of strikes me, a lot of the people I've met over the last few years who are in the sort of area that I've talked about are tend to be from overseas. The second thing I want to talk about, though, is there's always a danger when you talk the way I've been talking today, when I talk about place and sense of place and rootedness and belonging, that in some way I'm trying to say, oh my, by the way, if you're not from here, if you've come from overseas, if you're, whatever, that you're not really part of. It's actually the opposite, I believe. I think that most people who come to a new country, I found this myself in my own case. When you go to another country, it's now your home. You become very interested in that home because it's now your new home. That you're oftentimes intrigued by its history, its language or whatever, and you're trying to discover that thing that oftentimes you feel you don't have because you weren't born there. So I actually think that people from overseas, or from other countries who come to Ireland, I think they have that, oftentimes, that deeper sense of something. And when I argue, and I've done today, argued about place and rootedness, I'm actually saying that is a great unifier. That is a great way for people who aren't from here and people who were born or can go back generations. This is a great way for building and nurturing community. Because I think that once we're all part of that home, that place, and we have that sense of belonging, no matter where we've come from, I think it creates that wonderful dynamism that leads to the sort of creativity and innovation that I've been trying to get across today. So in fact, I think I think what I'm talking about is as much about people from outside this country as from this country. It's certain, but the unifier, as I said, is we're now in our home. They're now in. They've made the decision to be here. We are born here and staying here, or whatever. I think that in a globalized world, what I'm really trying to say is that we cannot. I think it's a huge mistake to sort of to say, oh no, this place belongs to us and you must stay away. What you need is, in a globalized world, in some way the two of them dance together. That is the sense of a deep belonging, and at the same time being very international and looking outwards. Those two must, in a way, dance together. And the reason I teach, as I said earlier, in Finland and in Copenhagen as well. And what I find about those countries, and you mentioned about Bornholm, that island as an example, Emer, is that those types of countries have a great sense of themselves, a sense of what I would do, but at the same time, they're very international. They have that sense of the two, of dancing together. I think in Ireland, for various historical reasons, etc., I think we tend to not be as much in balance, um, because I think we are not. Um, I mean, I think we're not as um, passionate as we should be about our own place, our own history, our own language, our own sense of. While at the same time, that's not inconsistent with being very outward and global and international. So when that person asked that question, I think it captures very well what I'm trying to say, which is Ireland, the place or the part of Ireland that you live in, is actually is the center of that world that I'm trying to describe. So I don't think there's anything in what I'm talking about today that is a disadvantage for the person who might have come and has decided to stay here and try and develop, for example, a business or a craft business.
Yeah. What she's saying, which is very interesting now, and I mean this is her view, and it's from
Yeah.
her experience that she came from the UK 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And the biggest difference that she finds is here is an emphasis on people and your connections rather than job and financial achievement. I don't know if I'd agree with Smurfit graduates might think slightly differently, but e.g. when you're introducing yourself in the UK, you're described by your job. In Ireland, you're introduced by who you are and who you're related to and who you know, right? I also have a question here that someone's wondering if the watches are made in Denmark or they're outsourced.
Well, I have a confession to make. I better come clean. I learned one thing in teaching over the years. When I was a much younger teacher in the university, I tried to fake an answer, and I was caught out a few times. So now I tell the truth. I come clean if I don't know the answer to something. I don't quite know the answer to that, but I do know the answer to part of it. I use that example of Skagen or Skagen because I have one of the watches myself, and I didn't bring it today because I really wasn't going to. But I use it as an example in Denmark when I'm teaching there, and I show the watch and I say, you know, the reason I bought this watch was I went into a jeweler in Dublin, and the jeweler was describing the different watches and where they were from, and you know, and when he started showing a little picture of the place and the sea and the sand and the people making it, and it was a couple who had come back from the States and decided to set up their own watch company, a watch business, etc., as a craft business, etc. I was so taken by the story that I wanted the watch and I bought the watch. Now, and I've ended up with the watch. But I was using that example in Denmark, and one of the students contacted me afterwards and said, by the way, I don't want to deflate your story, but you know that company was bought out by a big multinational a couple of years ago, and it's now part of a big chain. It's still, I thought the story was a great story about this couple who decided to come home and go to an artist, a place where artists, you know, a place that was famous for artists, and build a whole watch company. My understanding, just to answer the person's question, my understanding is that they still do manufacture the watches in Denmark. But as I said, it's no longer owned by the couple who set it up, or at least, you know, it seems to have been bought out. But I think the story is good about the place, you know.
Okay. The sense of place, Anne Harrington-Rees is saying that, you know, that West Cork is a good example.
Yes,
very good example.
Perfect example. Yeah, and that it's very hard to put your finger on it. It's sort of it's in the air, you know. By the way, just going back, if you don't mind, Emer, to a comment that was at the very beginning about excellence. It's a word I didn't use that much today, but in fact, I see a direct link between that that sense of excellence, of going for something that is what you it's not good enough for you. You know, your standards are such that you want to make a craft piece or whatever, that it isn't, you're not driven by the market, you're driven by something greater than that, something, again, going back deep inside. I remember when I did some work years ago for actually the old Crafts Council, and I was so taken by the people who were craftspeople because they would spend a lot of time trying to get something right. And as a finance person at the time, I remember thinking how out of date we were in teaching about markets, etc. Because we never took into account, it was always about making money, if you will. And yet here I've been meeting people who cared about something deeper than money. You know, it in a way stimulated a lot of my thinking over the years. It was meeting those types of craftspeople who cared. Yes, they needed to make a living, and it's hard. And I feel it's a bit presumptuous of me today to be talking at a level about, you know, not caring that much about profit or making money, but caring about purpose. Because I know a lot of people, you know, they need to sell the product and they need to make a living, etc. But I'm hoping to get across that the Holy Grail is actually what that person spoke about earlier, about excellence and quality and doing the, you know, it's integrity and being true to who you are. And I'm saying all of that comes from that sort of something deep inside ourselves. It doesn't come from outside. You don't become excellent or high quality because somebody tells you to be. You become it because you've reflected on it, and that's why I put so much emphasis on knowing who you are and where you're from. Whether you've, again, going back to that other person who talked about coming to Ireland, whether you come from somewhere else or from Ireland is not that important. It's reflecting on who you are and what is your story, and who do you want to become.
Exactly, and I think that's reiterating the doer network that we have here. I mean, it's a personal aside, but a lecturer told me once that I am the lowest earning MBS Smurfit graduate, by many multiples of tens of thousands. But I'm really happy working with people who have integrity and who are part of this doer network. And back to the doer network and their comments. Someone is saying here that it's so refreshing to hear someone talking about business in terms of intangible value and limited growth rather than outsourcing and profit.
And in fact, Emer, again, sorry for interrupting, but I'm so taken by this. I think the potential, when I hear about development, for example, in I'm not sure what the right term is, in marginal areas in Ireland, or disadvantaged places there, or if you take places that are away from them. And when I use that example from Wales of that do lecture series, and where people, I think, and the example from Finland of collaboration. I think the potential for very innovative collaborations and in the craft area is enormous. I mean, you mentioned Bornholm, that island, part of Denmark, off the coast of Denmark, which is sort of, in many ways, has created this brand and seems to live the reality of bringing people together who are, for example, we'd say top chefs from Copenhagen go there during the summer, and the restaurants do a thriving business. They have a lot of art and craft businesses, and they all that sort of sense of a place that when you go there, you meet people from those. You're more likely to meet people with those backgrounds, and businesses thrive because they're all sort of in the one place. And I think the potential for doing that in Ireland is a kind of what frustrates me a lot of times in Ireland is, and I've had lots of relationships in the Financial Services Centre, and I've had lots of relationships in innovation centres around Ireland, but I would love to see more. I would like to see more that are not necessarily about the sort of the latest high tech sort of innovation centre. That I think there's as much potential to do what I'm talking about today with people in the craft area, rather than just assuming that innovation. You see it a lot of times with policymakers. They sort of seem to link together R&D, labs, science, and innovation. And there's as much creativity, and far more exciting creativity, I think, going on in the world I was describing today, or the world we're talking about today. Certainly as what I saw in the Financial Services Centre, or what I've seen around the country in various innovation hubs, and what I call innovation hubs.
Yeah, that's so reassuring and refreshing in a while. I mean, I think I'll have to have you back to do stage two of this discussion. No.
This is so. I feel in front of an audience like this, I feel what's the word? I feel so vulnerable, because I'm not obviously a maker myself. I'm not a designer, and even in finance, when I taught finance over the years, I used to say to people when I used to go into banks, and whenever would meet somebody inside when you go into a bank and there's a teller and you can go inside, and I used to be so excited in there, because even though I taught finance and taught about banking, I never actually knew how banks worked inside. So there's a danger I might be cut out if I really had to go too deeply in with craftspeople who, because I'm an outsider. I'm a kind of an academic reflecting on the world. But I think it's a world that I would love to be part of. It's a wonderful.
Yeah, but
world.
I mean, your external observations show great insight. They really do. And I mean, that's part of the reason that I've invited you today, because I don't know, I think I first met you about 6 or 7 years ago, and I've always thought that. So I'm just going to go back to some of these comments. There's a person was speaking to us anonymously initially. He's not Irish, but Ireland is now his home. And how, and he wanted to know, you know, about this, when it is become his home, that's this place. Now he's decided that he's not going to be anonymous anymore, so that's a credit to you. So so thank you for that, Antonio. And
thank you, Antonio.
We have a comment here. Craft businesses of 5 and fewer employees making high quality goods with no business debt is the go forward strategy. Okay, discuss, Professor of Finance. What do you think?
I absolutely agree. I think what is neat, small is beautiful. I mean, that's what I was trying to get across today, you know. And yet at the same time, small is not disadvantaged. It frustrates the hell out of me when I hear about scaling as being the only option. I'm not saying you shouldn't scale, and if people want to grow or if people want to make more money, that's fine. I'm not, you know, but this idea that you cannot have a thriving business with 4 or 5 people, as the person commented on or said, and have a going back to those words of excellence and quality, top quality, and you know, and flourishing, and all those other words. I think is not true. I think you can do very well. I mean, the Inish Man example that I used is a great example. I mean, over the years I've met Turlough the Blockham, the owner, etc. And I mean, that business, and it, you know, could easily scale, but you would lose maybe something of the essence of what we're talking about, that sense of belonging, of being part of a community, you know, in Inishman, an Irish-speaking island, etc. So I think going back to place, I think you would lose the essence of that intangible thing I'm calling that sense of place, which is embedded or embodied in the product or whatever. If you go beyond a certain size, but there's no reason why you can't be small, beautiful, and thriving. And I think our policymakers should be thinking that way.
And it's extremely important. And it's extremely important.
Absolutely.
To the economy. I mean, if we have craft and design makers who are dotted all over the country, employing themselves and themselves, even just themselves, or themselves and 1 or 2 or 3 others, that's extremely significant. Extremely significant.
I think there are innovative ways. I don't have them off the top of my head, obviously, but I would love to see very innovative ways in which there is not that, maybe that sense of isolation, and maybe between different makers. You know what I mean? That maybe COVID, with all the tragedy associated with it, has made us now realize that there are ways we could collaborate and cooperate and come up with different models of small but integrated in some way. I'm not sure what I'm saying, but you know what I'm saying, that I would, because what frustrates the hell out of me in Ireland when I drive around, or when I drove around before COVID, is when I was growing up, you would often go into small towns. I'm not saying there were craft businesses necessarily, but there was thriving businesses in a lot of those towns that were local, that were owned by, we'd say, families going back generations. A lot of that, I think, has gone, you know, and I think, and I'm convinced that the future of, if again I may be presumptuous as somebody living in Dublin, but the future of rural Ireland, I believe, is in that sense of place, but not in a sort of that flippant way people sometimes talk about, decentralization or something, moving civil servants from one part of the country to another, or setting up. I think it's not about sort of an extra Garda station or keeping a Garda station, no matter how important, or a post office. It's about people having thriving lives and working on business in small places where there is a sense of community. And that's why I put so much emphasis on that sense of place that I think is is what policymakers should be spending more time at, I think, you know.
Exactly, exactly. I'm going to Finbarr bring a few of the comments together because there are a
All
lot
right,
coming in. Okay,
and I could go on talking forever, you know that, Emer. You
you
know.
just bear with me for a second.
Okay.
It's Lorna's saying she's returned home to Ireland. She's come home, but completely burnt out from a creative career in the US. She's on board with your philosophy, and many thanks. Delighted to discover you. And then we've another that it would be great if the process of collaborations were initiated from educational institutions reaching outwards into business and craft communities. We need more collaborations, and I think
Absolutely.
the Creative Academy in NCAD, and it's linked with UCD,
Yeah.
in the very near future. That hopefully will be happening.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, right. Here's a bit of a fan club. Emer, this is wonderful. I've Finbarr's book in front of me. I referenced it in my MA research
You did not.
study
Oh,
on the intangible value of authenticity.
oh my God.
Is echoing what I'm definitely saying. Such an honor to hear him speak. Anna has really enjoyed it. Okay, Finbarr, you're not getting off the hook here.
Oh gosh.
From
Go on.
Belfast, but wondering in a general sense, how can we influence funders and policymakers to help make more space for makers and small businesses more accessible in our cities and urban areas? So that's one. If maybe you could talk about.
Yeah.
Finbarr, what do you think?
You know what? I'm reminded of a talk I gave about 10 or 20 years ago when I was sort of talking the same stuff. I've updated it, but I was still arguing this in some way. And I remember somebody in the audience um, putting his hand up, and he said, I've been listening to you now for a few years. This was a few years even previous to that. And he said, is anybody else listening to you, right? Um, and 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 over the years, I've tried to. I mean, the reason I wrote those books over the years was to try and influence policy in some way, because I only have the one thought, if you will, or one theme which I built a whole argument of philosophy around. The sort of stuff I've been talking about today. The closest I got to it, it's a kind of a half funny story, was at the launch of our first book that I wrote with Jim Kennelly in New York. Brian Cowan was Taoiseach, and he launched the book in the city centre in Dublin. And he said at the launch that, you know, I'm very taken by your ideas, and I think we're going to try and implement them, or he said something like that, right? But of course, if you remember 2008 or 2009 when the crash happened and whatever, and he was gone within a month, you know, of the book launch. I can tell you here and now. So that was my first attempt, my best attempt at it. I also remember a person who's now a minister, actually, at a talk I gave. He came up to me afterwards and invited me into Leinster House because he was so taken by what I was saying. This kind of argument, again, it's not like I was saying these things only today or yesterday. I've been saying these, as I said, for a long time. And he invited me in, and he said, you know, he was in the opposition at the time. I won't give away any secrets of it. He's now in government. I guess I've told a bit about but it never went anywhere, mainly because I thought it was a political kind of a thing. It wasn't, there was no kind of real searching for what I was arguing. I wasn't talking about some sort of a manifesto or something. It was about, you know, having passion for Ireland and loving your country and caring deeply about, you know, giving people opportunities. I see it. I see it especially with my students I teach in UCD one course now, and I mean the hunger there is. I get them to write essays, and they write essays, and young people. I mean, I would say the people, 80% of the people who write these essays would love to set up their own little company, go back to where in Ireland they've come from, but inevitably they end up going into the IFSC or in a big multinational working, and it really gets to me because I think that a lot of those young people are reflecting what that last questioner asked. They want they want something that has deep meaning for themselves. You know, they want to make some. They're prepared to give up money. They're prepared to work for less if they could only be doing something that means something in terms of using their hands or using in some way, going back to what I said, is collaboration, etc. I don't think you can achieve it, to be honest. And what I'm talking about, I don't think you can achieve it if you don't do what I talked about earlier about reflecting much deeper um, on who we are and where we are. You know that, and I think that trying to convince uh, policymakers without that deep sense of place and sense of self, of being in a special place that's no better than any other place in the world, but is different and distinct and unique and has its own history, just like every other place in the world. I don't think that is, I think that message is so difficult to get across because it is much easier for policymakers, as we all know, to announce that a new company has come in and will create 200 jobs in a call center or a new banking, whatever, IT company or whatever. And again, I'm not trying to knock it because people do need employment and whatever. But but it's so difficult to get across that it would be far better, going back to this idea of 4 or 5 people, of creating an environment or a milieu where in 20 years' time you could have thriving 1,000 people with small businesses, which would take a lot of effort and a lot of nurturing, rather than one big announcement where there's 200 or 1,000 jobs or something, which is much easier for politicians to handle. They like being able to announce 1,000 jobs from a multinational, which, you know, I'm not denigrating the people who work with you know, with multinational companies, but I think that when, you know, one of the slides I did leave out today, and I could have put in far more, and you're probably saying, oh my God, he put in too much, but because I went over time. But one of the slides I was going to do was go back to the Irish revival or the Celtic revival of 1890 to 1920, before the foundation of the state, where there was this wonderful creativity of people from the arts, from literature. You know, we're thinking of poets, the setting up of the Abbey Theatre, the setting up of the Gaelic League, the setting up of the GA, from different, you know, people from different traditions. A lot of them were women who set up enterprises themselves. You know, the Irish Art Decoration Society and those types of organizations were set up by women. And there was a huge thriving creativity. This was a new sense that there was an emerging, there was going to be an emerging of of a new Ireland. I think there was a bit of that in the 60s. Um, Again, in the 60s, which, for example, you take the Kilkenny design workshops were set up in the 60s, and the sort of innovation and creativity that occurred in the 60s with with the people, a lot of them, going back to the earlier questioning, who came from overseas. They were, you know, there were a lot of people who came in the 60s and worked for the Kilkenny design workshops. That spirit was in the air when the Kilkenny design workshops were set up. And I think, to be fair, what you do, and this is not me saying what wonderful people you are in the Design and Crafts Council, but I think ye have a great role to play in what I'm talking about, because I think you're interacting with a lot of the people that I'm kind of removed from them. But I think that the spirit of what I'm trying to get across, I think, is in Ireland, and we can do it. But it will take a kind of what I tried to show, and that's why I put the slide the way I did at the beginning, that those 2 columns where I said sort of science and technology, or whatever I put, logic on the left hand side, and then I had this fuzzy soul, spirit, imaginative on the right hand side. And it's so much harder on the right hand side, because you're talking about terms like quality, you're talking about feelings and emotions, and it's much easier to say a number. Whenever politicians argue, for example, you'll see one of them will argue, oh, I can put 500 Gardaí on the street, what can you do? And if you start saying things like, well, I can make the streets safer by creating nice communities, it's a much harder thing to sell. It's much easier to say a number. So I find what I talk about very difficult, because I'm talking in fuzzy, sort of deep things about the human.
Well,
You know what I mean?
It wasn't that
It's
fuzzy,
harder.
because I think testament to your fuzziness, as you describe it, which I don't agree with you. I mean, I've actually found it enthralling. I think you're great. Is the fact that you have retained 99% of our audience for the entire time that you have been speaking. So I think that's a credit to you.
Well, I'm really
I'm
grateful.
also going to say that one maker here has said, I mean, I'm just going to bunch together, is that he has always been self-employed. Paternalism by the government is smothering. I agree, but probably not, I shouldn't say it too loud, but I do agree. And the organization of makers should be by makers for makers, so that you have that kind of cultural democracy rather than
absolutely
of culture stuff.
Emer, I know I'm interrupting you, but this is so important.
Yeah.
Like, I used to run innovation programs in, unfortunately, they were in big multinational banking and whatever. But I used to say to people, the best way to stimulate is not to start interfering with people's creativity. What I would do, and I tried to do always, and I still trying to do with my classes, is try and give people a vision, tell people what you're trying to do, support them, and then leave them alone, if you know what I mean. Because human beings, just like that last speaker said, or the last questioner or person who made the comment said, what you need to do is create a milieu, a wonderful, enriching milieu, support the milieu, allow a lot of freedom, but give a vision of some sort, or at least, all right, the questioner said the vision will come from the people. Yes, but there needs a vision of some sort, because you're constantly trying to, I think you're constantly trying to be on the interface between chaos and order. So you need order of some sort, you need a building or buildings or whatever it is, a facility of some sort that works in some way. It can't be just too chaotic, but at the same time, you need to stimulate creativity by allowing people loads of freedom. You don't want to be telling people what they should be doing and only giving them money if they do what you tell them they should be doing. You give them freedom, you tell them what the goal is, you change the goal if the goal isn't working out. And I think makers are the right people to be running this sort of show, if I'm not using the wrong word that I'm talking about. So you have a vision, you have an order, you have chaos in some way, and that it's out of that you have the flourishing or thriving community of people who will then in some way flourish over the years.
Exactly. You are just hugely inspiring, Finbarr. I've got someone back here saying, have Finbarr back. He's been brilliant, Emer. He's exactly what we need as craft makers, artists and designers. The fact he says he's an outsider is the reason he is able to be natural and make so much sense. More collaboration is the way forward.
The only danger with that caller or that speaker might find themselves in trouble, because when I used to get guest speakers, I won't mention any names, and I'm sure there's nobody in the audience who was ever a guest speaker in one of my classes, but I used to say to people, so-and-so gave a great talk, but that was all they had in them. You know what I mean? There wasn't much more than that. I think maybe if I came back again, people would say, I thought Bradley was here a while back. He said the same stuff. He's only repeating. So I think maybe I should be careful about going back.
Maybe we'll allow a little time pass. But you're being far too self-effacing, and that's it. I'm just going to say that you're too self-effacing. Okay, so what I'm going to say is that we were coming out of this sense of place.
Yeah.
I definitely think you're the doer network here. We'll keep up our values, and I'm going to end on this. Such a positive, inspiring talk. This has really cheered up my afternoon. This person says, thank you very much.
Gosh, I'm so grateful myself.
Thank you so much to the audience today. And Finbarr, thank you for giving us your time.
Yeah, so thanks, Emer.
Thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Well,